Hello, listeners. This is Tosca at NGO Soul+Strategy. Leadership transition, particularly that of executive leaders, is a tricky and kind of a high-risk stage in the life cycle of a nonprofit, an NGO, or a philanthropy. Not only is the choice of a successor high stakes, especially if it concerns a founder, but even equally, or at least also often in more general terms. In fact, I once read a statistic that for more than 40% of incoming leaders, this is in the US, after a founder steps off, their tenure is no more than 2 to 3 years on average. And this is obviously very expensive for nonprofits. And moreover, one fraught often with emotions as well. Transitions in leadership within nonprofit organizations are complex. They depend on a lot of things, which we're going to talk about in this episode. So how do we orchestrate the handover in such a way that the NGO is well set up to transition into new leadership? Ignacio Saiz, an NGO leader, now turned consultant, so no longer an NGO executive director, has thought deeply about this and has recently practiced it in his own former INGO. And he's here to tell us. Welcome, Ignacio.
Thank you, Tosca.
I'm looking forward to this. So a quick bio on Ignacio. He is currently a full-time consultant and senior advisor on human rights, economic justice, and strategic leadership, and has been for the last almost 2 years now, right?
About a year and a half, yeah.
A year and a half, right. He was, importantly, for 15.5 years at the Center for Economic and Social Rights, and we'll learn about that in a moment. And of those 15.5 years, for 12 years, he was the executive director, and before that, 3 years as research director. He has also held various managerial and leadership roles at Amnesty International, including director of policy programs, deputy director for the Americas, and several other roles. So, Ignacio, let's start with the basics. Tell us a little bit about the Center for Economic and Social Rights, because when you and I, this is a long time ago, worked with each other, that was kind of an organization in a fairly new subsector. What is it about? And then finally, when did you step off?
Sure. Thank you, Tosca. So the Center for Economic and Social Rights is an international organization, an international NGO that works to harness the power of human rights to bring about fairer and more sustainable economies. What that means in practice is that the organization carries out research, advocacy, skills sharing, and capacity building on how human rights tools, human rights instruments, human rights norms, human rights mechanisms can be used in practice to challenge unfair economic policies. So austerity measures that, for example, have an effect in weakening public services, or unjust tax policies that widen the gap between the rich and the poor, or development paradigms that are don't bring about more transformative changes in the economy. So these are the kinds of issues that the center works on.
Right.
And that organization between the nexus of human rights and development or economic justice.
Exactly. And that's what not that is the topic of this episode, it's not, but just to point out that the center was a representative of, back then, 15 to 20 years ago, new kind of human rights work on the economic and social right, and not just on the individual political and legal rights, which is what many people would think about at that time, right? And you stepped off. You left that role of executive director when?
I left in March of last year, so March 2022.
Okay. So tell us a little bit more about the context, the broader circumstances in which you transitioned out of that role. Is there anything about that context, since we're going to dive deep into leadership transitioning out and how to do that, that we should know as listeners?
Sure. my role as executive director of the center is a role that I will always treasure. I learned so much. I worked with the most amazing people. It was a continual source of learning. I never tired of the role. The reason I left, I always felt, and I still feel as a matter of principle, that human rights organizations kind of need to model the values that they espouse externally. And one of those values is around, how long you should stick around as a leader of an organization. I firmly believed that, it would not be good for me or for the organization to be the head of the organization for longer than 10 years. That's something of an arbitrary, cap, but I had that very present in my mind. The only reason that 10 years became 12 years was because of the pandemic. Just as I was ready to leave, the pandemic happened, and that's, for obvious reasons, not the time to be, that's a time for stability and continuity, not a time for radical change. But I really felt that it was important for my own professional development and for the development of organizational leadership, for me to honor that commitment. And a number of a number of conditions I felt had to be in place, or I wanted a number of conditions to be in place for me to make that move. And I can talk about that if
a little bit, or do you want to maybe give us a quick high level overview? Sure. And then I suspect that we'll go into that. Also, just to point out, I'm so glad that you had that value, because it is my anecdotal perception in the sector that there are still too many leaders who do not leave on time, and it can really hamper an organization. So I'm glad you had that. But tell us a little bit more about other circumstances. Yeah.
I mean, I would point to three things that I felt enabled me to say, okay, this is not a bad time to leave. This is not a disruptive. I don't think that there's ever an ideal time to leave. No. And leaders are always going to say, oh no, but I can't leave now because this is going on. There's always something. There's always something that you can convince yourself needs you to delay your decision. But
easily.
Yeah, but in my case, there were kind of three fundamentals, I would say. We had a relatively healthy board culture. The board, the chair of the board had been in place for a while. There was, a degree of stability on the board, of experience on the board, because you need a healthy board. Yeah. At a moment of leadership transition. It's true.
That's probably the most important in some ways, because they have to, of course, recruit your successor.
Yeah. Absolutely. So you need stability there when there's going to be a degree of instability at the staffing level. Secondly, we had a strong leadership team at the staff level, which I thought was also very important, and a great degree of buy-in from my colleagues on the leadership team to a planned transition. I mean, this was a situation where I had decided to leave independently of getting another job. This wasn't a sudden, oh, I'm leaving because I'm going to move on to another organization. So we had the luxury, in a way, of a planned transition. Yeah. I actually gave 9 months notice. So it was a very carefully planned transition. And the leadership team felt a strong buy-in. We were able to discuss and plan together elements of the transition, obviously not the recruitment of my successor, but broader elements of the transition itself. And I think a third factor was we had just laid the foundations for a new strategy, and this was also informed by the experience of the pandemic. And that also felt like a good time to leave. I feel I've contributed to the strategic process. There's a great degree of organizational buy-in at the staff level and at the board level in this new vision. I don't need to be around to implement it or to put it in place, and so it just felt a good moment in the strategic cycle of the organization. Yeah. So.
Just a quick comment, and there are two sides to this, as there are to so many other things. Some consultants and coaches for leadership on leadership transition would argue actually the opposite. They would say, leave it to a new incoming leader to help shape that next strategy, right? But your argument is equally valid in my mind. Namely, let's have a good strategy. We're clear on that. And the new leader is clear about what they have to help shepherd, right? Yeah. So it's just interesting that there are these two sides to the same.
No, I agree. I think there are powerful arguments for saying the opposite. You shouldn't condition too much the vision of the organization or the plans for the organization, because then you're constraining the new person from, bringing their own ideas. And I think we were conscious of that, and the board was conscious of that, and made sure that, what we had in place was broad agreement on the broad parameters and the broad strategic directions. But my successor came on board at a time when, that the operationalization of that strategy was still very much
in play.
It was still in play. Yeah.
Okay, got it. Yeah. So in the case of the Center for Economic and Social Rights, CESR, what do you feel, if you look back now, what made this transition to your mind successful and or challenging? Because things can ultimately be successful, but they still can have some real challenges, right? At a meta level, if you will, if stepping away for a moment, what made it overall successful and or challenging, before we go into the specific advice that you have for leaders and managers who are listening?
Sure. Well, I think one thing that I've alluded to already, it was a planned transition. It didn't happen in a moment of crisis or in a moment a sudden change in my personal situation or in the organization situation. It was very, very planned. Yeah. So we had, as I say, I gave 9 months notice. That enabled us to put in place a transition plan, and I'm a big believer in a written transition plan.
Okay.
Some people might say, "Oh, that just sounds so bureaucratic," but my experience is that if you don't have that, it can give rise to all sorts of misunderstandings, or oh, I didn't know this was my role. A written transition plan that defines roles and responsibilities, the limits of, say, the outgoing executive director, the limits on my role in the recruitment, for example, but that also has clarity of timelines, so that staff are aware. This is critically important. Staff need to be aware of what's going to happen when, what opportunities they have to contribute to the process, to share ideas. Is there an involvement in decision-making or in consultation or information sharing? All of that. I think a success factor was the degree to which we discussed those things openly, not just in the leadership team of staff, but with a broader staff team and with the board, and the extent to which those things were written down. I think that's really important, and everybody has a common reference point to understand where we are in the process. I think I would say a third ingredient was that there was, generally speaking, a shared appetite to use this as an opportunity, not to see it as a crisis. Oh my God, Ignacio's leaving. What are we, but okay, this is an opportunity to reflect collectively on what kind of leadership do we want in the future. It might not look like Ignacio. It might not.
No, and often it doesn't, right?
And often it doesn't. And bear in mind that this was happening against the backdrop of worldwide discussions on what leadership looks like, and who, white supremacy in the nonprofit sector. And how oppressive and discriminatory values are often embedded in our sector, just as in any other. So against that backdrop, this was an opportunity to say, okay, not just kind of what profile do we want, what personal profile, but also what models of leadership. Because maybe a more collective leadership, or within feminist movements, for example, there's a lot of exploration and interesting experimentation in more shared models of leadership, less hierarchical models of leadership, less models of leadership that are less rooted in very patriarchal assumptions. And so I think there was a pretty widely shared appetite to have those conversations in the organization as well, which I think was also instrumental in its, I'm not sure if it's in its long-term success, but certainly it made people see this was an opportunity.
An opportunity, indeed.
As well as,
Got it. Yeah. So when it comes to preparing an organization for the departure of an executive director, what key strategies or tactics that you haven't, are there any other key strategies or tactics that you haven't mentioned yet? I just want to give you that opportunity before I go one level, not down, but looking at the organizational culture aspects of how it went at CSR.
I think one crucial thing was to remind ourselves that a transition is more than a recruitment. Because that might not be self-evident to everybody involved. And certainly I would say, speaking candidly, you know, we had some conversations with the board around that. You know, this is much more than just, you know, replacing one person and putting out a job advert. This is, for the reasons I was saying, this is an opportunity to think about what kind of leadership we want in future, how the organization has evolved, you know, its current strengths and weaknesses, as opposed to the strengths and weaknesses of the organization when I spoke with CD. So I think it was really important. I'm not sure if this is a strategy, but in a way, it's an approach. I think it's really important for organizations to see that this is a broader issue around organizational governance and culture, and not a recruitment process.
Yeah, so that's an intentional approach indeed, right? Again, looping back to what you just said about it being it was seized as an opportunity in an intentional way. Anything else you want to say about that before I ask you about some behaviors and so on?
Sure. I think being very intentional also around communication. Like we actually drew up a communication strategy. And again, some people might say, oh, that's unusually bureaucratic. Why do you need it?
Oh, no, I think it's highly recommended.
You really needed it. And so our communications director was very, you know, sort of took the lead in working with the board, with the leadership team on, you know, what kinds of communications do we need to the outside world, internally, to funders, to donors, and that.
Can you tell a little bit more about that? Can you unpack that further? So, like the outside world, which stakeholders did you not just plan for, but turned out to be particularly important to have explicit communication to, and then internally also what kinds of communication, the avenues, the channels, because what some people, there are big differences in what people at a personal level, at the individual level need, right? Some people like big picture. Some people want to know, okay, what does this mean for us next week?
No, we had to be very mindful and intentional of these different audiences. And that includes our internal constituency, if you like, the family, broader family of CSR, which is the board. And we had an advisory council, which was a more honorary governance structure made up largely of people who'd formerly been on the board, kind of thing. So we, you know, when should we inform them? What kind of input do we want from them into the process? Then obviously partners, our key partners and allies, the organizations that we have partnerships with, at what point do we inform them, letting them know early enough so that, you know, they can also play a role if necessary in spreading the word, but also not doing it so early that it spreads the word that, oh, Ignacio's leaving, you know, and I'm going to be around for another 6 months. And do you see what I mean? That
you've been there for 12 years. Huh? That's
Yeah. But also you have to calibrate the need for early communication, but not so early that you sow insecurity and rumor and
that's interesting, right? That's a nuance.
Which is why you need a strategy. You need a timeline with these things set out. Otherwise you're making it up as you go along.
And then
that's never healthy. Yeah.
Right. And you mentioned funders. We'll go there in a moment because that's an important one, obviously. But how about peers? It's different from partners. Peers, should they know? Were they a constituency or not so much?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to distinguish peers from partners. I mean, there were peers who I'm very close to that have been my sounding board.
Exactly.
And some of those people I would have told quite early on in confidence. Okay. But then other peers would have been more in the kind of partner category, where we would tell them when communicate the message about leaving when you have something else to inform them about, which is there is a process. Our board is fully on board. You want to convey that there is a clear strategy and process in hand. This is not chaotic. This is not, something unexpected.
So this is about credibility, maintaining credibility and reputation and so on, and a sense of stability that the organization will not go adrift.
Yes, and that also the team is not going to be so consumed with internal transition issues that it's not going to be a good partner to your organization. We're still there. So that those reassuring messages are really important to convey.
Yeah.
And to be able to convey reassuring messages, you need to communicate when you have a clear vision of what's happening.
Yeah.
So for that reason, the timeline was very important. And then
funders?
More broad. Well, funders were very, very important. So I had one-to-one conversations with the key funders. I think in all cases it was like over the phone and by Zoom or in person, personalized. It wasn't just like a cold, by the way, I'm leaving. Because they were also we wanted their input as well on these questions. What kind of leadership should the organization have? And, involving the board in that as well. I mean, the news would come from me, but then I would quickly loop in my board chair or other people from the board to be part of that conversation with funders also.
I see.
So that's also very, very important.
Yeah. And then internally, anything, I mean, there's the different layers in the organization, but senior team managers are often very important because middle managers, CSR is not a very big organization, but still middle managers is where all the other staff, that's where they get their messaging, and not just in literal, that's also where they get their signaling, right? So how anything particular on the communication side that you learned?
I would say with regard to the managers, close and frequent communication is the key.
Yeah.
So I think we had a very healthy culture of on the leadership team. It's a small leadership team for the reasons that you've mentioned. We're not it wasn't a very hierarchical organization. So we were, it was important for us to have at least weekly conversations around the transition. The other thing I would say in terms of internal mechanisms, we set up something that we called then the transition team, or the transition forum, I think we called it, which 3 or 4 members of the leadership team. We were 3 at one point, we were 4 at another point, with the members of the executive committee of the board, which was also 3 or 4 people. So
you mean this was basically 3 staff who interacted on a weekly basis with 3 members of the executive committee?
We didn't do it weekly. I think we had these once a month, probably.
Okay, but they on a regular basis they interacted.
Yeah, it was a forum that didn't exist before. In some organizations that forum already exists, but most commonly the interaction with board or with the executive committee of the board is usually done by the executive director.
Yeah.
But for the purposes of the transition, precisely because this is more than just a recruitment, this is about, making sure the organization is ready for this transition more broadly.
Yeah.
We created this monthly forum, and I think that was extremely useful in having these conversations. Of course, you have to be careful around what's off limits in that conversation, because the leadership team and the outgoing executive director cannot be involved in the minutiae of the recruitment.
Right.
And so, we weren't meeting to discuss the details of the recruitment. There was a separate search committee for that was led by the board.
Yeah.
But we discussed everything around the recruitment. Like, how do we put in place, how do we put the house in order so that a new executive director can hit the ground running, doesn't have to deal with, messy fundraising issues or, so it was really like putting the house in order type.
Putting the house in order, yeah, well put. And so when I like to think about organizational culture, I like to pull it down to the level of not so much kind of principles and values and what we believe in, but more what is the articulation in real habits, behaviors, and practice. And sometimes, as you know, there's a gap between what we say we are about and how we really behave, and how we also are, what we are really rewarded for. Anything on habits, behaviors, and practices that struck you also in hindsight as being, because we're all human beings, right? That particularly helpful or unhelpful when it came to transition. I guess that depends, amongst others, if there's any tensions or uncertainties, difference of opinion. I don't know, just asking.
Sure. I would say participation, the degree to which this process would be a participatory one. Again, there was a common commitment amongst staff and in the board that this should be participatory, that we should follow the practices in terms of staff engagement, as well as getting input from outside actors and voices. Of course, the trick is in what does that mean in practice, and the definition and the contours of participation in practice. So at the center, the board decided that the search committee should include 2 members of staff, which is actually quite unusual in some senses. Immediately raising the questions, well, do those 2 staff so 2 of the 5 search committee members were members of staff. If you have that degree of involvement of staff, which I think is really healthy, you need to be crystal clear about decision making. Is the search committee making the ultimate decision on recruitment? If so, do the staff members have the same say as the board members? Or is the search committee's decision or deliberations, are they advisory to the whole board, which is how it ended up being at CSR. So I think, without betraying confidences, I'm not sure that was crystal clear from the very beginning when the search committee was formed. So I think it's really important in these processes to define with crystal clarity what is the scope of decision making,
the scope of decision rights and authority
of the search committee and of the individual members of the search committee, if some of them are staff and others are board members. I think it's
really interesting and really important, because that could cause some really So as we approach the end of the interview, I'm particularly interested, are there any pitfalls that you, and when I say you, I mean not just you, Ignacio, but also the organization as a whole, or overlooked pitfalls or overlooked aspects that we haven't talked about yet? And within that, I haven't heard you talk much, and maybe there wasn't much, and that could be just fine, but psychologically and emotionally, both in yourself and in those the constituents, right? What did you notice? Are there pitfalls there? Are there overlooked aspects there that we could all learn from?
I think it's you shouldn't underestimate how much anxiety can be generated around a transition of this kind.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I perhaps did underestimate it because in my own head, I was pretty clear that my time had come to move on. And I felt good about that. And, you know, if anything, I'd stayed on a bit longer than I intended to, for the reasons I mentioned.
Yeah.
I was already mentally prepared to leave, but
you are ready.
But the news was still a shock to staff in ways that I said, but hang on, I've been around forever. It shouldn't be that much of a shock to you, but it was. And so, you know, I would say don't underestimate the apprehension that might set in about the future. What does this mean for me? And that's why the importance of messaging, the importance of clarity about the process is really fundamental. The importance of voice, of opening forums, like we had staff meetings where people would express their, their questions, their anything you were afraid to ask about the transition, ask it now. Wouldn't always be in a position to answer it. Sometimes it was for the board to answer, but it was important to open that channel. I should mention we actually, there is one critical thing that we haven't talked about, and that's the need for external support.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and it's something, again, if I have a criticism about how we handled it at CSR, I think we underestimated the amount of external support that was needed. It's very difficult for boards, particularly people who give up their time voluntarily, who have busy full-time jobs,
governing boards
in small nonprofits in particular. It's very difficult for them to take on the task themselves of a whole recruitment process and everything that is needed around that recruitment process. I felt that we needed the support of, if not a search firm, because search firms are not right for every organization. Sometimes search firms are for a bigger organization, but not for a smaller one. But we needed some kind of external consultancy support. In the end, we did have some external consultancy support for the staff side of things, for the issues I was mentioning earlier around staff participation.
So that was facilitative support to gather that.
So we had a consultant to talk one-to-one with staff members. How do you feel about this? What are your ideas? And that was very important, I think, to shape, as critical input into the process. What I think was missing was a similar degree of support for the practicalities of the recruitment process, to work with the search committee. I felt that was under-resourced, and probably I think most people involved in the process, including the board, would probably agree in hindsight that we didn't resource that sufficiently.
So can you just unpack that for a moment? Practicalities of recruitment for our listeners. What are you thinking of? I think, I'm not saying at all it doesn't make sense to me, but just unpack it, please. Practicalities. What are we talking about for those who have not gone through this much?
Right. I think having somebody to accompany the search committee in, setting a good process, drawing on good practices.
For interviewing and pre-selection and all of, and
I would say even helping with the kind of project management of the process.
That makes sense.
Board members, the chair of the board or other board members who were involved in the recruitment, it's a lot to ask of them to do that themselves, and they
and also because we know that once we get to the first, and this also, by the way, has diversity, equity, and inclusion aspects to it. The way we source potential candidates, right? The way we scout, right? And then how we screen them and how we interview people. So there's lots of ambiguity and bias in it, etc. And so of all kinds. And so how to structure the particularly those things in a way where you have the highest quality of interview, because otherwise interviewing can be quite a crapshoot, right? I think there's plenty of research that says that interviewing is really pretty much a crapshoot unless you do it in certain structured ways. And even then the outcomes in terms of right fit are, the records, and not just in our sector, that's true in the private sector too, are mixed at best, right? Yeah.
I fully agree that external support is needed on the board. This is a board-led process. It has to be a board-led process, but the board needs help.
Yeah.
Both in terms of capacity, but I would also argue in terms of equity, the equity issues that you were pointing to.
Yeah.
However well-intentioned a board is, and most human rights boards are well-intentioned around questions of equity, there's good practice. There are good and bad practices around this.
Exactly.
To have somebody who is guiding you constantly around that is really important.
It's quite important. So then finally, before I ask you, where can people go to find out more about you? How did you and your successor, without asking to divulge things that you don't want to, how do you and your successor agree on, negotiate, etc., to what extent you would play any continued role or engagement in any kind of capacity? As you know, there's a variety of views in our sector on whether that's a good thing or not. Really, I've seen many, many different views, and it seems to be highly contextual at the very least. So how did CSR and you and your successor figure this out?
It's a great question. So despite the fact that I gave 9 months notice, there was still a gap between my leaving and my successor, Meghna Abraham, taking on the position I think she joined in August and I left in March, which was a shame. And it also goes to show how transitions, including, the recruitment part of transitions, often take much longer than you originally think. So I was to me, it's a fundamental principle that as the outgoing executive director, you should not be hanging around haunting the organization. I am very skeptical about organizations that have a former executive director and they put them on the board. I really don't think that's good governance.
Yeah, it seems very risky to me.
There might be situations, exceptional situations, where that's necessary. I know a couple of organizations working in particularly hostile environments where that has happened, and you can make the case. But I felt passionately that there's no role for me on the board. It conditions too much my whoever comes next, and I also felt that. And this was my offer to Meghna, and I think there was a very common understanding there. If I'm available if you want my help, particularly because we didn't have an overlap period, which is a shame, and I felt it would be useful to have an overlap. So I said, I'll make myself available, but it had to be at her request. At her request. Yeah. So to me, that's the crucial thing. It has to be at the request of the successor or at the request of the board, if the board feels that that's necessary. But I feel just as there are limits around the outgoing ED's role in the recruitment. I mean, the ED should play practically no role, I think, in the recruitment. Similarly, there's a very limited role outside any onboarding that the new ED requests or that the board requests on the ED's behalf.
Got it. Okay.
And at that point, just a note about what's important for boards to be mindful of. Boards very often see the recruitment ending when the person is in place. Big mistake. The transition
classical mistake. Yes.
The transition also includes 6 months, if not a year,
of transitioning in
onboarding, of making sure that person is doing well, has everything they need. Yeah. So transitions last at least 2 years.
They do.
In practice, if you think about the preparation phase, and then leading to the including all the kind of onboarding and support for the new person or people, if it's a co-director situation.
Yeah.
Well, that's at least 2 years, even post agile process.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So let me ask the final question then. Yeah, where should people, you've developed a new identity since then. And so where should people go if they want to find out about Ignacio Saiz, the consultant? Where should they go?
So I'm working on a dazzling new website, but until then, the more conventional form is LinkedIn. I would say people should look me up on LinkedIn. I don't think there are many Ignacio Saizes, S-A-I-Z or Z.
That, yeah,
is my surname. I don't think there are many of us on LinkedIn. So the one with a smiley face and human rights in the bio
is most likely yours. That sounds very good. Well, thank you, Ignacio, for all your insights. I find this topic really important, and you were very insightful. And thank you, listeners, for listening in to us. If you found this podcast episode stimulating, then be sure to check out other episodes of my podcast, NGO Soul and Strategy, that focus on leadership thinking in our sector, such as, just to name a few, episode 49 with Martha Holly Newsom on women top leaders in faith-based organizations. Episode 65, we just had that with Adama Coulibaly, as well as episode 52 with John Samuel, both from Oxfam, about transitioning in or other aspects of leadership. And soon I will be airing an episode with Sam Worthington, the former president and CEO of Interaction, the US umbrella organization for INGOs, on life after leadership. What happens to your state of mind, your sense of identity after you leave very high profile position of power like that? And how do you take up that new phase in life? So you can find these episodes and much more on my website, 5oaksconsulting.org. That is with the number 5, but also on my YouTube channel. Subscribe to my email and you will always be the first to be in the know. With that, this is Tosca, and I look forward to spending time with you next time on NGO Soul and Strategy.